The hiss of the steam engine was a dying breath in the oppressive heat of Redemption Gulch. For Alina Vance, it was meant to be the sound of a new beginning, the fanfare for a life she'd only read about in cautiously optimistic letters. She stood on the splintered platform, her Boston traveling dress wilting her gloved hands, clutching a worn carpet bag. He was there just as his photograph promised, Jedediah Croft, tall and handsome. But the smile from the picture was gone, replaced by a sneer that curdled the air. His words, when they came, were not a welcome, but a verdict delivered with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly. "You're not what I ordered," he said, loud enough for the whole station to hear. Humiliation, sharp and hot, washed over her. The world shrunk to the space of her own shame until a shadow fell across her. She looked up, not into the face of a sympathetic townsperson, but into the unreadable dark eyes of a silent Apache warrior who, against all reason and decorum, held out his hand. The journey west had been an exercise in curated hope. Alina Vance had spent 3 weeks on rattling trains, her world shrinking from the manicured gardens of Boston to the endless rolling plains of a country that grew wilder with every clatter of the wheels. She was 23, the daughter of a once proud shipping merchant, whose death had revealed a fleet of debts rather than a flotilla of assets. Marriage was not a dream, it was a lifeboat. The letters from Mr. Jedediah Croft had been her blueprints for this new life. They spoke of a sprawling ranch under a sky bigger than any she had ever known. They spoke of prosperity, of building a dynasty in the heart of Arizona territory. His penmanship was elegant, his prose direct and reassuring. He enclosed a photograph of himself leaning against a white picket fence, a confident smile on his face, his eyes seeming to promise stability. He had paid for her ticket, a gesture of immense generosity that had sealed her decision. She would be a good wife. She would learn to love the dust and the sun. She would make him proud. Redemption. Gulch was not the picture he had painted. It was a raw, dusty wound in the earth, a single street flanked by wooden buildings that looked like they were holding on against the elements by sheer force of will. The air was thick with the smells of horse-hot metal and something vaguely acrid she couldn't identify. And Jedediah Croft was not the man from the letters. As he stood before her, his fancy waistcoat and polished boots seemed at odds with the raw contempt in his eyes. He was flanked by 2 other men, cowhands, by the look of their worn leather and dusty hats, who were smirking openly. I said, Jedediah repeated his voice louder this time, enjoying the spectacle. "You're not what I ordered. The agent in St. Louis swore you were a blonde. And comely. This," he gestured dismissively at her from her dark auburn hair, pinned tightly in a bun to the toes of her sensible boots, "is plain as a mud fence." Each word was a physical blow. Alina felt the blood drain from her face. The townsfolk who had gathered to witness the arrival of the mail-order bride were now a gallery of gawking strangers. Whispers skittered through the crowd like mice. She could feel their pity, their morbid curiosity. Her carefully constructed hope was disintegrating into a pile of dust at her feet. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice trembling, but determined to maintain a shred of dignity. "There must be some misunderstanding. Your letters were most complimentary." A harsh laugh burst from him. "My letters." He shot a look at a formidable older man who had just stepped out from the station master's office. The man was broad with a face like a granite cliff and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. This had to be Silas Croft, Jedediah's father, the patriarch of the empire. "My father handles the correspondence," Jedediah sneered. "And the business arrangements. He's the one who needs a brood mare for the Croft line, not me. But I'm the one who has to look at you over the breakfast table. And I won't." Silas Croft stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Jedediah, we had an agreement. This is a respectable young woman from a good family. She's a pauper from back east whose father left her nothing." Jedediah retorted, his rebellion fueled by an audience. "You bought her like you buy cattle, father. Well, this bull ain't taking this heifer." The vulgarity of it sent a fresh wave of shock through Alina. This was a nightmare. She was stranded, penniless, thousands of miles from anything she knew being debated like livestock. Her composure finally cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She clutched her bag, her knuckles white. She had to get away, to run. But where? The crowd shifted, a collective murmur of discomfort and anticipation. No one stepped forward. No one offered a word of comfort. The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a tin star on his vest, simply watched from the edge of the platform, his hand resting on his hip, a man who knew better than to interfere in the affairs of the Crofts. Her isolation was absolute. It was in that moment of profound desolation that the shadow fell over her. He had been there the whole time, leaning against a support pillar of the station's awning, a silent observer. She hadn't noticed him, had filtered him out as part of the harsh landscape. He was Apache. It was unmistakable in his high cheekbones, the straight line of his jaw, and the long black hair held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin trousers and a loose-fitting cotton shirt, worn but clean. He was lean, but there was a coiled strength in his stillness. Unlike the jeering cowhands or the apathetic townsfolk, his face was a mask of stoicism. His eyes, dark and piercing, held no pity, but a deep, unnerving intensity. They weren't looking at her humiliation. They seemed to be looking through it to the person underneath. He moved with a fluid grace that was startling. He pushed off the pillar and walked directly towards her into the charged space between her and the Crofts. The crowd fell silent. An Apache warrior walking into the middle of a white family's dispute was unheard of. It was dangerous. He stopped directly in front of Alina, ignoring Jedediah and his glowering father completely. His gaze was fixed on her face. For a long moment, he just looked at her. And in that look, she felt something she hadn't felt since her father's death scene. He saw not the rejected bride, not the object of scorn, but the woman standing on the precipice of ruin. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand, palm up. It was a simple, unambiguous invitation. It was a lifeline thrown into an ocean of contempt. Her mind reeled. Who was? What could he possibly want? Every instinct of her Boston upbringing screamed at her to recoil. This was a savage, a man from the wild lands, the subject of terrifying stories and whispered warnings. Accepting his hand was madness. It was social suicide. It was perhaps physical suicide. But then she looked back at Jedediah's cruel smirk. She looked at Silas Croft's furious, possessive glare. She looked at the faces in the crowd, hungry for the next chapter of her downfall, and she realized she had already fallen. There was no lower to go. Her reputation was already in ashes. Her future was a blank, terrifying page. The hand he offered was calloused and strong. It promised nothing but an escape from this single, unbearable moment. It was a choice between a known hell and an unknown wilderness. With a deep, shuddering breath, that was half sob, half gasp of defiance, Alina Vance lifted her own hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, secure grip. Without a word, he turned and began to lead her away from the platform. The crowd parted before them, a sea of stunned, disbelieving faces. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Silas Croft bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. "Unhand her, you heathen!" The Apache warrior did not pause. He did not look back. He kept walking, pulling Alina gently but inexorably with him. "Let him have her." Jedediah scoffed, a cruel finality in his tone. "Looks like she's found her own level after all." The words followed her as they stepped off the platform and onto the dusty main street. Alina did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the strong, straight back of the silent man who held her hand, leading her away from the ruins of one life and into the terrifying, uncharted territory of another. The man's name was Tala. She didn't know this yet. For now he was just a presence, a silent guide leading her through the heart of the town that had so brutally cast her out. Every window seemed to have a face, every doorway a pair of staring eyes. The whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. A white woman, a lady by her dress, being led away by an Apache. The scandal was a living thing, breathing in the dust-choked air. Alina's mind was a maelstrom of fear and adrenaline. Her feet, clumsy in their city boots, stumbled on the rutted street. Each time his grip on her hand would tighten a steadying force. He didn't seem to notice the stares. Or if he did, he was utterly indifferent to them. His focus was singular forward. They left the main street, passing the blacksmith's forge, where the ringing hammer fell silent, and the livery where men stopped their work to gawk. They moved towards the edge of town where the buildings grew sparse, and the vast, intimidating landscape of rock and scrub began to assert itself. He led her to a tethered horse, a lean, wiry mustang that watched their approach with intelligent eyes. He stopped and finally looked at her. He gestured with his free hand towards the horse, then to the vast open country beyond. It was a question. "Are you coming?" There was still time to turn back. She could run to the sheriff, or perhaps to the church, and throw herself on their mercy. But the memory of their inaction, of their silent complicity on the station platform, was still a fresh wound. They had watched her fall. This man, this stranger, had offered her a hand. She looked at the horse, then back at his unreadable face, and gave a single firm nod. He acknowledged it with a slight dip of his chin. Effortlessly, he swung himself into the saddle. He then reached down for her. She hesitated for a moment, her dress and petticoats a cumbersome obstacle. He waited patiently. Awkwardly, she placed her foot on his, and with his strong arm around her waist, he lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, settling her to sit sideways in front of him. The proximity was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. His body was a wall of warmth and solid muscle behind her. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. He clucked his tongue, and the horse moved into a smooth, ground-eating trot, leaving Redemption Gulch and its judgment behind them. They rode for hours. The sun beat down, and the landscape shifted from dusty plains to a rugged terrain of rust-colored canyons and towering mesas. Alina had never imagined a place so empty and yet so full of a fierce, raw beauty. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by the plodding of the horse's hooves and the cry of a distant hawk. Her fear began to slowly recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a dawning curiosity. Who was this man? The stories in Boston were of savage raids and brutal warfare. But there was nothing savage in the way he guided the horse, nothing brutal in the steady way He held her secure. He moved with the land, not against it. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, he guided the horse down a narrow, almost hidden trail into a small, secluded canyon. A thin ribbon of a creek trickled through the center, lined with cottonwood trees. Tucked under a rock overhang, almost invisible against the stone, was a small, crude cabin. It was not a teepee or a wickiup, but a structure built of timber and mud, with a stone chimney and a single window. It looked solid, permanent. He dismounted and then lifted her down. Her legs were so stiff, she nearly buckled, but he caught her elbow, holding her steady, until she found her balance. He then went about his tasks with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. He unsaddled the horse, led it to the creek to drink, and then set it to graze on a patch of sparse grass. He disappeared inside the cabin and emerged a moment later with a small axe. Alina stood awkwardly, her carpet bag clutched in her hand, feeling useless and out of place. She was a woman, trained in needlepoint and piano, in managing a household staff she no longer had. She knew nothing of this world. Tala, the man she now knew as such, having heard a passing scout call his name, returned with a small pile of firewood. He entered the cabin, and a few minutes later, a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. He came to the doorway and gestured for her to come inside. Stepping over the threshold was like stepping into another world. It was small, just a single room, but it was meticulously clean. A simple cot with a wool blanket was against one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall with a few pots and a skillet hanging beside it. In a corner there were carefully folded hides and what looked like tools for tanning and carving. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, self-sufficient life. He gestured for her to sit on one of the stools while he moved to the fireplace. He added some dried herbs and what looked like jerky to a pot of water and set it over the fire. The aroma that soon filled the small space was savory and comforting. He worked in silence, and Alina watched in silence. The quiet was not empty. It was thick with unspoken questions. She wanted to ask him 1,000 things, but the words wouldn't come. And even if they did, would he understand? Would he answer? When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls and placed one in front of her, along with a carved wooden spoon. He sat opposite her and began to eat. Hesitantly, she took a bite. It was simple food, but it was hot and nourishing, and she realized she hadn't eaten since dawn. She ate every last drop. When they finished, he took the bowls, washed them in a bucket of water, and set them aside. The rhythm of his domesticity was calming. He was not a threat. He was a protector. But why night fell completely, and the canyon was enveloped in a profound darkness and a deeper silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Tala took one of the thick wool blankets from the cot and offered it to her. Then he pointed to the cot itself. His meaning was clear. It was for her. Where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice a rough whisper, the first words she had spoken since leaving town. He didn't seem to register the question, or perhaps he didn't understand. He simply took a folded hide from the corner, laid it on the floor on the other side of the hearth, and settled down upon it, turning his back to her, to give her privacy. Alina stood frozen for a moment. This man, this heathen, as Silas Croft had called him, had offered her his food, his fire, and now his bed, while asking for nothing in return. He had shown her more decency and honor in a few hours than the civilized men of Redemption Gulch had shown her at all. She slowly lay down on the cot, pulling the surprisingly soft blanket up to her chin. She didn't take off her dress, still a fragile armor against this new world. She lay there listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of his steady breathing. For the first time in a long time, despite the strangeness of her situation, a sliver of peace settled in her soul. She was no longer Alina Vance, the rejected mail-order bride from Boston. She didn't know who she was anymore, but she was safe. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of the silent Apache warrior sleeping on the floor, a guardian in the darkness. Back in Redemption Gulch, the sun had set, but the fury of Silas Croft was still at its zenith. The saloon, usually a raucous place of laughter, and piano music was subdued. Men drank their whiskey and spoke in low tones, all of them aware that the town's most powerful man was on a rampage. Silas stormed into the sheriff's office, his face a mask of purple rage. Sheriff Brody, a man named Thomas Brody, who had seen too much to be easily rattled, didn't even look up from the report he was writing. "That savage," Silas spat, "has my sons intended. He's kidnapped a white woman in broad daylight, and you, Sheriff, you just stood there." Brody carefully blotted the ink on his report before looking up. His eyes were weary. "Silas, what I saw was a woman who had been publicly and cruelly humiliated. I saw a man offer her his hand, and I saw her take it. There was no struggle, no sign of kidnapping. She's a delicate woman from the East. She was frightened. He's taken advantage of her." Silas slammed his fist on the desk. "I want a posse. I want you to hunt him down and bring her back. And I want that Apache's scalp." "I can't form a posse for a kidnapping that didn't happen," Brody said calmly. "Besides, you know who that is. That's Tala. He's not a renegade. He scouts for the army out of Fort Grant sometimes. He keeps to himself. He's never caused a lick of trouble." "He's causing trouble now." Silas leaned over the desk, his voice a low, menacing growl. "That woman represents a business contract, Brody. Her family might be broke, but their name still carries weight with some people I need to impress back east. This marriage was meant to legitimize my holdings, to give the Croft name a veneer of old-world respectability. Your indifference is jeopardizing my future." Brody leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He knew what this was about. It was never about Jedediah's happiness. It was about Silas's ambition. "This is a Croft family problem, Silas. Don't try to make it the town's." Silas's eyes narrowed to slits. "Fine. If the law won't act, I'll hire men who will." He turned on his heel and stormed out, leaving the sheriff sighing in the lamplight. Brody knew this was far from over. Silas Croft did not tolerate being defied. Silas found his son Jedediah drinking heavily at the saloon. Jedediah looked up, his handsome face flushed with whiskey and a mixture of defiance and shame. "I trust you're proud of yourself," Silas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've made a mockery of our name and thrown away the best chance you had." "She wasn't for me." Jedediah slurred, gesturing to the bartender for another drink. Silas grabbed the glass from his hand and smashed it against the wall. The saloon fell silent. "This was never about you. It was about the family, about securing our legacy." "What about Isabella?" Jedediah's voice was suddenly sharp and sober. "Did you think I'd just cast her aside, the woman I love, for some package you ordered through the mail?" Isabella. The name hung in the air. She was a singer at the saloon, beautiful and fiery, with a reputation as tarnished as the spittoons. She was everything a man like Jedediah would desire, and everything a man like Silas would despise. Silas's expression turned glacial. Isabella is a momentary distraction, a whore who will be gone when her looks fade. The Vance girl was your future. He leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. But you've made your choice, and now you will fix it. You will ride with the men I hire. You will show this town that you went to rescue your poor, terrified fiancé from the clutches of a redskin savage. You will restore your own honor, even if it's a lie. Jedediah stared at his father, horrified. You want me to hunt them, after I'm the one who drove her away? You will do it, Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Or I will make sure your precious Isabella is run out of this territory on a rail if she's lucky. I will see to it she never works in any saloon or cat house from here to California. I will ruin her. Is that clear? The color drained from Jedediah's face. He was trapped. His one act of rebellion had only tightened his father's leash. He looked around the saloon at the faces of the men who worked for his father, who drank his father's whiskey, who lived in his father's town. There was no escape. Yes, father. He whispered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Silas nodded, satisfied. He strode to the center of the saloon. I'm paying $500 for the return of Miss Vance, and another $500 for the man who brings me the Apache, dead or alive. The posse rides at dawn. A murmur of excitement went through the room. That was a fortune. Men who had been apathetic spectators just hours before were now eager participants. Among them was a man named Cole McCall, a notorious bounty hunter known for his ruthlessness and his particular hatred for Apaches. His face, scarred and cruel, split into a grin. He had just found his next payday. Jedediah Croft, son of the king, sat alone at his table, drowning in guilt and whiskey. He had rejected a woman to save his love, and now to save his love, he had to hunt the woman he'd rejected. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He was going to be the hero in a story where he knew with sickening certainty that he was the villain. The days in the canyon settled into a strange and quiet rhythm. Alina's Boston dress was soon ruined by fetching water and gathering firewood, and it felt like shedding a skin. One morning, Tala left a pair of soft buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt outside the cabin door for her. They were boy-sized, probably his own from years ago. Wearing them felt scandalous and liberating all at once. For the first time, she could move freely, climb the rocks behind the cabin, and feel the earth under her feet without the prison of a corset and petticoats. Communication remained a challenge and a revelation. Words were useless, so they spoke in the universal language of action and intention. He taught her without teaching. She learned by watching his hands. She learned which plants were for eating and which were for medicine. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of the trail: a bent twig, a displaced stone, the faint print of a coyote's paw. He would point, and she would truly look, with an intensity she had never known. In return, she brought her own world to the cabin. She found a piece of charcoal from the fire, and on a smooth, flat stone she began to draw. She drew the ship her father had owned the house in Boston, a flower from her mother's garden. He would watch her, his dark eyes, following the lines, a flicker of understanding in their depths. One evening, as she was tending to a small cut on her hand, he noticed the jagged white gear on her forearm, a childhood memory of falling from a tree. He reached out his fingers, tracing the scar so gently it made her breath catch. It was an intimate gesture, a question asked without words. She touched the scar, then pointed to a tall, gnarled tree outside the cabin, and mimed falling her face a mask of childish pain. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines. Then his expression grew somber. He pulled up the sleeve of his own shirt, revealing a terrifying puckered scar on his bicep, the unmistakable mark of a bullet wound. He then began a story in the dirt. He drew figures, a man, a woman, a child, a family. He drew a teepee, their home. Then he drew other figures, men with hats and rifles, soldiers. He made the sound of gunfire, a low, guttural noise in his throat. He wiped away the figures of the woman and child, leaving only the man alone. He pointed to the lone figure, then pointed to himself. Alina stared at the tragic drawing, her heart aching. His silence wasn't a choice of culture or stoicism. It was born of a trauma so deep it had stolen his voice. The family he had lost, the life that had been violently ripped away from him. She understood now that they were both survivors, both cast adrift by forces beyond their control. She, by the quiet ruin of finances and social disgrace. He, by the loud brutality of violence and conquest. She reached out her fingers, hovering over the drawing in the dirt. Then she did something bold. She drew another figure, a woman in a dress standing next to the lone man. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You are not alone now." He stared at the drawing for a long time, his jaw tight. When he finally looked at her, the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw not the stoic warrior, but a man drowning in a sea of memory. He gave a single, slow nod, a profound acknowledgement that sealed a bond between them, far stronger than any words. A few days later, a new discovery forged another link in that chain. Alina had been cleaning out her carpet bag, the last bastion of her old life. Inside, tucked into a side pocket, were the letters from Jedediah Croft. She pulled them out, the elegant penmanship, a bitter reminder of the lies she had believed. She was about to toss them into the fire when Tala, who had just entered the cabin, froze. His eyes were fixed on the envelope in her hand. He strode over his movements, urgent, and took it from her. He stared at the handwriting, a look of intense concentration on his face. He then walked to a small wooden chest in the corner, a place she had never seen him open. He lifted the lid and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a supply requisition form, written in English. He laid it on the table next to her letter. The handwriting was identical. At the bottom of the requisition form was a signature, a bold, arrogant scrawl, Silas Croft. Alina stared, her blood running cold. It wasn't Jedediah who had written her. It was his father. The entire courtship had been a business transaction orchestrated by the old man. Jedediah's cruelty at the station wasn't just a whim. It was a rebellion against a fate that had been forced upon him, a fate that had included her as an unwitting pawn. Tala pointed from the signature to the envelope, then looked at her, his expression grim. He knew the name. He had likely seen Silas Croft at Fort Grant, or in town, a powerful white man who treated the world as his personal property. He understood the depth of the deception. Alina sank onto a stool. The letters and the requisition form spread before her. The truth was uglier than she had imagined. She wasn't just rejected. She had been purchased, and the goods were found to be unsatisfactory by the son, even if the father had signed for the delivery. Tala placed a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was solid real. In a world of lies and manipulation, his silent presence was the only truth she could hold on to. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her partner in this tangled web. And as the sun set over the canyon, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, Alina knew that the world they had escaped would not let them go so easily. Silas Croft was not a man to let his property, whether it be cattle or a mail-order bride, simply walk away. The confrontation was not over. It had not yet truly begun. The peace of the canyon was shattered by the distant sound of a shod horse stumbling on rock. Tala heard it first. He went still, his head cocked, his entire body, a listening instrument. He put a finger to his lips and motioned for Alina to get away from the fire. The scent of wood smoke, their comfort, had now become a beacon for their hunters. He moved to the edge of the canyon, overlook his body, blending seamlessly with the rocks. Alina followed her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the distance, snaking their way through the arid landscape, was a line of riders. A posse. Even from this far away, she could see the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. They had been found. Tala's face was grim but calm. There was no panic in his eyes, only a focused, calculating intensity. This was his land. He was not the prey. He was the master of this domain. He turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. He pointed to himself, then to the rocks and trails around them, a silent vow that he would protect this place, their sanctuary. Then he pointed at her, and then to the small cave system, hidden behind a waterfall deeper in the canyon. It was a clear instruction, hide. Stay safe. She wanted to argue, to say she would not leave him, but she saw the resolve in his face. Her presence would be a liability in a fight. Her safety was his priority. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. As the posse drew closer, their voices carried on the wind, coarse laughter and greedy speculation about the bounty. Leading them was a man with a scarred face, Cole McCall. His cruelty, a palpable aura around him. And riding reluctantly among them, his face pale and drawn, was Jedediah Croft. Seeing him there hunting her was a fresh betrayal that stabbed deeper than his rejection at the station. Tala moved like a ghost. He was not preparing for a battle, but for a strategic defense. He dislodged a precariously balanced pile of rocks, creating a small landslide that blocked the easiest path into the canyon, forcing the posse to take a longer, more treacherous route. He used his knowledge of the terrain to lead them on a wild goose chase, his tracks appearing and disappearing, drawing them away from the cabin and the cave where Alina was hidden. Alina, concealed in the damp coolness of the cave, could hear the frustrated shouts of the men. She was not a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. Tala had taught her to be resourceful. She gathered smooth, heavy stones, a pitiful arsenal. But it was something. She was no longer Alina from Boston. She was a woman of the canyon, and she would defend her home. The hunt went on for hours. The sun reached its peak and began its descent. McCall's frustration grew into a rage. "He's playing with us," he roared. "Spread out. Search every damn crevice. The first man to spot him gets a bonus." Jedediah used the order to break away from the main group. Guilt was eating him alive. He had no desire to find Tala, and even less to find Alina. His one hope was to locate them first, and somehow warn them. He followed a small game trail, his eyes scanning the rocks, not for a target, but for a sign of mercy. It was then that he saw him, Sheriff Brody on his own horse, perched on a ridge overlooking the whole scene. The sheriff wasn't with the posse. He was shadowing them. A small flicker of hope ignited in Jedediah. Brody was a decent man. A man of the law, not of his father's payroll. Meanwhile, McCall, in his bloodlust, finally stumbled upon the cabin. "He's here," he bellowed. "The fire's still warm." The posse converged on the small dwelling, tearing it apart in their search. The violation of their small, peaceful home sent a wave of anger through Alina. Tala knew the time for evasion was over. He had to draw them away from the cave. He let out a sharp cry, the call of a hawk from a rocky outcrop high above them. It was a challenge. "There he is!" McCall screamed, firing his rifle. The shot echoed through the canyon, and the bullet sparked off the rock inches from Tala's head. The final confrontation had begun. The posse scrambled up the rocks, firing wildly. But Tala was in his element, moving through the treacherous terrain as if it were a flat plain. He didn't fire a weapon. His goal was not to kill, but to neutralize, to survive. He used a rope to trip horses, sent small rock slides to block paths, and disappeared into shadows, only to reappear elsewhere, a phantom leading them on a deadly dance. From her hiding place, Alina saw an opportunity. Two of McCall's men were trying to circle around to get a clear shot at Tala from behind. Their path would take them right below her cave. With all her might, she heaved one of the heavy stones she had gathered. It crashed down through the brush, startling their horses and sending one of the men tumbling to the ground. It was enough of a diversion. Tala saw her act of defiance, and a look of fierce pride crossed his face for a fleeting second. But the odds were still overwhelming. McCall, a relentless hunter, finally managed to corner him on a narrow ledge. He had Tala trapped with a sheer drop on one side and McCall's rifle on the other. "Nowhere left to run, savage," McCall sneered, leveling his weapon. "Stop!" The voice was Jedediah's. He had scrambled up the rocks, his face desperate. "McCall, don't. This is wrong." "Get out of the way, Croft," McCall snarled. "This is between me and him." "No." A new voice, clear and strong, rang out. Alina emerged from the cave, stepping into the open. In her hand, she held the letters from her bag. "This is about lies. It was never a kidnapping." She stood on a rock across the small chasm from them, her face filled with a righteous fury. "This man Tala saved me. He showed me honor, when your town showed me none. The man you should be hunting is Silas Croft." She held up the letters. "He's the one who wrote these. He's the one who bought me and deceived me. Jedediah, tell them. Tell them the truth." All eyes turned to Jedediah. He was pale, trembling, caught between the bounty hunter, the woman he had wronged, and the silent warrior who had protected her. The weight of his father's threats and the sight of Alina's courage finally broke him. "She's right," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "My father arranged everything. I rejected her. She left with Tala of her own free will. This whole hunt is a lie." McCall stared at him in disbelief. Then his face twisted in rage. "I don't care about your family squabbles. I was promised a bounty." He swung his rifle back towards Tala. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from McCall's gun. It was from Sheriff Brody's rifle, fired from the ridge above. The bullet kicked up the dirt at McCall's feet. "Drop it, McCall!" Brody's voice boomed with authority. "This is over. I've heard enough. You're hunting an innocent man on a fraudulent bounty." McCall hesitated, his greedy eyes darting between Tala the sheriff and the money he was about to lose. In that moment of hesitation, Tala moved. He lunged forward, not at McCall, but at the rifle, deflecting the barrel just as the bounty hunter, in a final act of spite, pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. Tala used his momentum to slam McCall against the rock wall, disarming him with brutal efficiency. The fight was over. The posse, seeing the sheriff's intervention and hearing Jedediah's confession, lowered their weapons, their loyalty to Silas Croft's money, overridden by the authority of the law. The echoes of the gunshots faded, leaving a ringing silence in the canyon. In that silence, Alina, Tala, Jedediah, and Sheriff Brody stood the truth finally exposed under the harsh light of the Arizona sun. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a somber affair. Sheriff Brody had Cole McCall tied to his saddle, his face a thunderous mask of defeat. The rest of the posse trailed behind, avoiding eye contact with Jedediah, who rode with his head held high for the first time in his life. Alina and Tala followed at a distance the quiet space around them, a world away from the turmoil they were returning to. The town met them with stunned silence. The sight of the rescued bride riding calmly beside her savage captor, followed by a disgraced Jedediah and an arrested McCall, completely upended the narrative Silas Croft had so carefully crafted. The final confrontation happened on the main street in front of the Croft Emporium. Silas stormed out, his face apoplectic when he saw the procession. "Brody, what is the meaning of this? Where is the savage's body?" he bellowed. "The only man I'm arresting today is McCall for attempted murder," Brody announced, his voice carrying down the street. "And I'll be having a long talk with the territorial prosecutor about a man who offers a fraudulent bounty and incites a mob under false pretenses." Silas stared speechless as Jedediah dismounted. "It's over, Father," Jedediah said, his voice devoid of its earlier weakness. "The lies are done." He walked over to where Isabella was watching from the saloon doorway, her face a mixture of fear and hope. He took her hand in his, a public declaration that left no room for doubt. "We're leaving," he told his father. "We're going to make our own way." Before he turned to go, he stopped in front of Alina. "Miss Vance," he said the words, clearly costing him. "I cannot apologize enough for my cowardice and my cruelty. You deserved better. I hope you find happiness." Alina looked at him, at the man he was finally becoming, and nodded. "Go find yours, Mr. Croft." With a final broken look at the empire he had built on sand, Silas Croft watched his son and his future walk away. The power he had wielded for so long evaporated in the dusty street, leaving him an old, defeated man. In the days that followed, Redemption Gulch began to see with new eyes. The story in its true form spread through the town. Alina was no longer the pitiful, rejected bride, but a woman of incredible fortitude. And Tala, the silent Apache, was not a savage, but a man of quiet honor who had stood against the town's most powerful citizen and won. Alina had a choice to make. The sheriff offered her safe passage back east. The church offered her a room and a position helping the minister's wife. She was invited back into the world that had cast her out. But when she looked at the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, and the judgmental eyes that were now filled with a grudging respect, she knew it wasn't her world anymore. Her home was a cabin in a secluded canyon. Her peace was in the vast silence of the wilderness. She found Tala by the creek at the edge of town, preparing to ride out. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable as always. "They want me to stay," she said, her voice soft. "They say I have a place here now." He simply looked at her, waiting. "But my place isn't here." She continued, her gaze unwavering. "I don't belong in Boston anymore, and I don't belong here. I think I belong with you." It was a declaration more terrifying and more honest than any vow she might have made in a church. He searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or coercion. He found none. He saw only the strong, resilient woman who had fought beside him. He extended his hand just as he had on the station platform. This time, when she took it, it was not an act of desperation, but a choice of the heart. Months later, the canyon was truly their home. The garden she had planted was thriving. The cabin was filled with the smell of her baking and the sight of his intricate carvings. They had built a life from the ashes of their old ones. She spent the evenings teaching him to read and write, using her charcoal on smooth pieces of bark. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and hungry for the knowledge that had been denied him. He learned the shape of words, the power they held. One evening, as a cool breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves outside, she was pointing to the letters of her own name, which she had written on a piece of slate. Elara. She said it aloud, "Alina." He watched her lips move. He looked at the marks on the slate. A lifetime of willed slants, of trauma-locked words, fought against the desire to connect. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was rough, unused, like stones grinding together, but the word was clear, perfect. "Alina." She looked up, her eyes flooding with tears. It was more than a name. It was a bridge across the silence. It was the sound of his healing, the beginning of their future, a single word that held the promise of 1,000 conversations to come, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound connections are forged not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, patient language of the heart. And so in the heart of the unforgiving West, a story that began with brutal rejection and public humiliation found its end in quiet triumph. It wasn't a tale of grand riches or sprawling empires, but of something far more valuable, the forging of a bond between two outcasts who found in each other the home they had both lost. Alina Vance and the silent warrior Tala proved that courage isn't about the loudness of your voice, but the strength of your convictions, and that true sanctuary can be found in the most unexpected of places with the most unexpected of souls. Theirs is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the powerful unspoken language of honor and of evil. If this journey into the raw heart of the Old West moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this story with others who appreciate tales of drama survival and unlikely love. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that bring the past to life. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.